This is what $250,000 of financial ruin looks like. I'm 67 years old, and that money, my entire life savings, just bought me a single humiliating lesson and a photograph. The photo is of the house I paid for, with another man standing in front of it, his arm around my soulmate on their wedding day. If you've ever fantasized about retiring to a tropical paradise, this is the video you must watch before you book a flight or send a single dollar. So hit that subscribe button, because this is a warning you can't afford to ignore. My retirement plan had a pulse. It was supposed to be a life of warm weather, cheap beer, and a woman who looked at me like I was the hero of her story. For a while, that's exactly what it was. I was the king, the rich American who had finally found his paradise, and every dollar I spent just made the fantasy more real. I was building a future, I told myself, an investment in happiness. But I wasn't an investor, I was the investment. My nest egg wasn't a shield, it was a target painted on my back, and the woman I thought was my partner was simply the one holding the rifle, waiting for the perfect shot. It's a long, humiliating story, and I'm not sure where the foolishness ends and the tragedy begins. Every man watching this thinks he's smarter than me, that he would see the red flags. But these flags don't look like flags when they're waving at you. They look like love, like family, like emergencies you're uniquely positioned to solve. They look like 1,000 small, reasonable requests that pave a direct road to financial ruin. Before you can even see the pattern, you're standing at the end of that road, just like me, with nothing but the echo of your own stupidity. And it all started so innocently, with one simple decision that I now know sealed my fate from the very beginning. Before the Philippines, before I became the architect of my own ruin, there was just gray. My life in America had become a long, quiet corridor with no doors. My divorce wasn't a dramatic explosion. It was the slow, silent death of a star. One day, I came home from my shift to a house that was too tidy, her side of the closet empty, a note on the kitchen counter that said more with its brevity than 25 years of marriage ever did. She was gone. The kids were grown. The silence she left behind was a physical presence, a cold guest who moved in and never paid rent. My own home had become the loneliest place on earth. My job was a masterpiece of meaningless repetition. For 30 years, I was a logistics manager at a company that made parts for things I never saw. I'd sit in a beige cubicle, staring at spreadsheets, rerouting shipments of widgets and grommets from one side of the country to the other. I wasn't creating anything. I was just making sure the pieces of a puzzle I didn't care about got to their destination on time. I was a ghost in a polo shirt, respected for my efficiency but utterly invisible as a man. My colleagues were just other ghosts, all of us haunting the same hallways, counting down the minutes until we could go home to our silent houses. Evenings were the worst. The house was a museum of a life that was no longer mine. Every chair and picture a monument to a shared past that now felt like a lie. I learned to hate the weekends, those vast, empty deserts of time that other people filled with family and laughter. My life was a sterile, climate-controlled waiting room for death. I wasn't living, I was just waiting. Waiting for retirement, waiting for a commercial break to end, waiting for something, anything to happen. The highlight of my week was the automated checkout at the grocery store, a place where at least a machine would acknowledge my existence. The final straw, the thing that really broke me, was a holiday. I realized that if I dropped dead in the middle of my living room, the only person who would notice for weeks would be the mailman when the letters started piling up. My children, bless them, were busy with their own lives. They'd call on Christmas and my birthday, but the calls were short, dutiful. I was no longer a father. I was a financial backstop, an old story they occasionally retold. The profound, soul-crushing weight of being utterly irrelevant settled over me. I was a ship that had been decommissioned, left to rust in a forgotten harbor. And then, one night, while scrolling aimlessly through the internet, a pinprick of light appeared in the darkness. A video popped up. An older guy, looked a bit like me, grinning on a beach with a young, beautiful woman. The title was something like, "Live Like a King in the Philippines on $2,000 a month." I clicked it, then another, and another. For the first time in a decade, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't despair. It was a dangerous, seductive whisper of a second chance. An idea took root in the barren soil of my life. What if I wasn't done yet? What if my real life hadn't even begun? That first video was the gateway drug. I spent the next week, then the next month, falling down the deepest rabbit hole of my life. It was a digital pilgrimage into a world I didn't know existed. I devoured videos of guys who looked just like me, a little soft around the middle, their hair thinning, but with smiles so wide they looked like they'd split their faces. They were holding hands with women half their age, drinking San Miguel beer on pristine beaches, and talking about how their Social Security check made them rich. It wasn't just a different country, it was a different reality, one where men like me were still kings. My drab, gray world began to recede, replaced by the vibrant colors of the Philippines I saw on my screen. The initial, skeptical curiosity morphed into a feverish, almost academic obsession. I was on Expat forums at 3 a.m., cross-referencing cost of living articles and building spreadsheets that made my old logistics job look like child's play. My $250,000, which in the U.S. felt like a barely adequate shield against a few years in a mediocre nursing home, was a pharaoh's treasure in this new context. The numbers didn't just add up. They sang a siren song of a life I'd only ever seen in movies. But it was more than just the money. The narrative these men spun was about respect. They talked about a culture where age was seen as a sign of wisdom, not obsolescence. They described Filipina women as family-oriented, caring, and devoted, words that felt like a cool drink of water after a lifetime in the desert of Western feminism. In America, I was a ghost in a polo shirt. In the Philippines, I could be a patriarch, a provider, the center of a family that didn't just tolerate me but revered me. I wasn't just looking for a cheaper place to live. I was looking for a place where I still mattered. The decision, when it finally crystallized, didn't feel like a choice. It felt like an escape. It was the only logical answer to the question of my own despair. I started my reconnaissance on the Asian dating sites. Just looking, I told myself, a lie so thin it was transparent. I uploaded a photo from a few years back, the one where I was holding a big fish and looked more like a victor than a victim. I wrote a profile that painted me as a stable, secure man looking for a true partner to share in his golden years. I was building a lure, using the last vestiges of my American success as bait. I spent my evenings scrolling through a universe of hopeful smiles, each one a potential key to my new life. The women on these sites weren't like the women back home. They didn't look tired or guarded. They looked vibrant, full of a light that I desperately wanted to be near. Then I saw her. Her name was Rosalie. It wasn't a glamour shot, just a simple photo of her in a garden, but her smile, it hit me like a physical blow. It was the first genuine thing I felt I had seen in a decade. With a trembling hand, I wrote a simple, honest message. That night, just as the loneliness was starting to creep back in, a small notification pinged on my laptop. She had replied. That first trip over was a blur of giddy anticipation. I felt like a teenager flying to see his first love, my stomach doing backflips for 14 straight hours. Every part of me that had been dormant and gray was suddenly buzzing with life. The man who boarded that plane in America was a husk, a ghost. But with every mile we flew east, I felt flesh and blood returning to my limbs. I wasn't just escaping my old life. I was flying towards the woman whose smile had single-handedly resurrected my will to live. I had a picture of her taped to my carry-on, a ridiculous sentimental gesture that made me feel like the hero of my own movie. The moment I saw her at the airport in Manila, the world snapped into focus. She was even more beautiful than in her photos, a tiny, radiant sun in the chaotic sea of the arrivals hall. When she smiled at me, it wasn't the polite, cautious smile I was used to. It was a genuine, all-encompassing beam of light that made me feel like I was the only person on earth. She rushed into my arms, and for the first time in 30 years, I felt wanted. Not needed, not tolerated, but truly, deeply wanted. That first hug erased decades of loneliness. It was the best investment I had ever made. Those first 2 weeks were a waking dream, a perfect screenplay written just for me. Rosalie was my guide to paradise. She took me to places that weren't in the tourist brochures, small family-run restaurants where the food exploded with flavor, hidden beaches where the sand was white and the water was a shade of blue I didn't know existed. She held my hand everywhere we went, her fingers laced in mine, a public declaration that I was hers. For a man who had been invisible for so long, this constant, casual affection was intoxicating. It was a drug, and I was instantly, hopelessly addicted. I had forgotten what it was like to be touched with tenderness. Rosalie's affection was a language I hadn't heard in decades, but understood perfectly. She would trace the lines on my hand while we talked, rest her head on my shoulder during a car ride, or surprise me with a kiss on the cheek for no reason at all. It was the thousand small ways she showed me I was cherished. Back home, physical contact was something reserved for awkward holiday hugs. Here, it was the air we breathed. It made me feel young, powerful, and alive in a way my money never could. Meeting her family was like stepping into a warm bath. I was braced for suspicion, for the cautious appraisal of the old American with their daughter. Instead, I was greeted with open arms and overwhelming kindness. They called me Sir Donald, but with a warmth that felt like respect, not formality. They prepared a feast, a boodle fight, they called it, with mountains of food laid out on banana leaves. They treated me not as a stranger, but as a returning king. I looked at Rosalie, beaming with pride as she introduced me to each cousin and aunt, and I felt a sense of belonging I hadn't felt even with my own family in years. I began to understand the power of being a provider in a way I never had in America. Taking her family out for a nice dinner wasn't a transaction. It was an event, a celebration that I was able to create. Buying a new television for her mother's house didn't feel like an expense. It felt like a noble gesture that brought joy. I wasn't being asked for these things. I was offering them, eager to see the smiles they produced. Each small gift, each paid bill, was a scene in the movie of my new life where I was the benevolent hero, the man who could make problems disappear and create happiness with a wave of his wallet. One evening, she took me to a quiet spot overlooking the city lights. We sat there for hours, not saying much, just her head on my chest, my arm wrapped around her. She hummed a local folk song, a tune that was both sad and beautiful, and I felt a sense of peace that was so profound it almost hurt. This was it. This was the life I had been searching for. I wasn't a logistics manager or a divorcee or an empty nester. I was just a man, holding the woman he loved under a blanket of stars. It was a perfect cinematic moment, the kind you see in films and never believe is real. I was being reborn. The tired, cynical man I had been was shedding his skin, replaced by someone I barely recognized in the mirror. I was laughing more, smiling more. I bought new clothes, colorful shirts to replace the beige polo shirts of my former life. I was no longer a ghost haunting the hallways of my past. I was the main character in a vibrant, exciting story. Rosalie was the director of this transformation, coaxing out a version of me I thought was long dead. She didn't just love me, she seemed to believe in me, and her belief was so powerful it made me believe in myself again. Our relationship felt like a perfectly crafted story, and I was loving my role. Every day had a new, wonderful scene. One day, we were the adventurous couple, exploring a waterfall. The next, we were the domestic couple, shopping for groceries in the local market. It was a romance, an adventure, and a drama, all rolled into one. I was the wealthy, kind American who had found his soulmate, and she was the beautiful, devoted Filipina who adored him. It was a script that had been written 1,000 times, and I was so thrilled to be starring in it that I never thought to question who the screenwriter was. Leaving after that first trip was one of the hardest things I've ever done. The thought of returning to my silent gray house in America was physically painful. I was leaving a world of vibrant color and stepping back into a black and white film. Rosalie cried at the airport, clinging to me as if she couldn't bear to let me go. She made me promise I would come back soon, that we would start planning our future. The words were like music, a promise that this fantasy wasn't a fleeting vacation, but the beginning of my real life. My old life wasn't a life, it was just a waiting room, and I was finally being called in. As the plane took off, I looked down at the glittering lights of Manila, my heart aching with a mixture of sorrow and hope. I replayed every moment of the past 2 weeks in my head, a highlight reel of a life so good it felt stolen from a dream. I was already making plans, running numbers, figuring out how quickly I could sell my house, liquidate my assets, and get back to her. There was no question in my mind. My future was here, with her. I was all in, ready to bet my entire life savings on this feeling, on her smile. I was the happiest I had ever been, completely and utterly swept away by the current of this perfect love story. It felt more real than anything I had ever experienced. I was the king of my own little kingdom, and Rosalie was my queen. Every dollar I had spent was worth it 100 times over, just to see the look of adoration in her eyes. Looking back now, from this borrowed room with nothing to my name, I see that I was living in a beautifully constructed movie set. I should have realized that nothing that perfect could ever be real. But I was so desperate to believe it, I refused to see it. Back in America, the gray was grayer, the silence louder. The vibrant color of my trip began to fade, but the connection to Rosalie was my lifeline, a constant stream of messages and video calls that painted the future we were building. The first tremor in that future came disguised as a text message about a typhoon. It wasn't a major one, she said, but it had damaged the roof of her mother's house. Just a few small leaks, but with the rainy season coming, it was a problem, she sighed, but they would manage. And in that moment, I saw my opening. I wasn't being asked for anything, which made the offer feel all the more noble. I was her partner, her man, and I would be the hero who could fix things, even from 8,000 miles away. The $300 I sent for the roof repair was the best money I ever spent. It wasn't a transaction, it was a statement. It said, I am here and I can protect you. My savings account, that giant, motionless lake of numbers, suddenly had a purpose. It wasn't just a pile of money I was sitting on. It was a reservoir of power, and I had just opened a valve to solve a real-world problem for the woman I loved. Rosalie's gratitude was overwhelming, a torrent of praise and love that made me feel 10 feet tall. For a pittance, I had purchased a feeling of competence and masculine pride that I hadn't felt in 30 years. It was a bargain, and I was already looking for another one. The next request wasn't long in coming. It was subtle, wrapped in a story about her mother's worsening cough and the family's worry. They didn't have the extra for a doctor and the expensive medicines. The story was delivered with a sense of weary resignation, not a direct plea. I felt a surge of indignation on their behalf. How could a family's health be subject to the whims of having extra money? I saw the small fissures of their daily financial struggle and knew my reservoir could fill them without me ever noticing the loss. I insisted on sending money, framing it as my duty, my pleasure, to care for the woman who would one day be my mother-in-law. I rationalized it as a cultural investment. In the West, you meet the parents over a stiff dinner. In the Philippines, it seemed you became part of their support system. This wasn't a red flag, it was a rite of passage. I was showing them I was a real partner, a provider they could count on, not just another tourist looking for a good time. My money was a tool to build a bridge between my world and theirs, and each dollar sent was another plank laid in that bridge. I felt good about it, noble even. I was a man of substance, proving my worth through action, not just words. The small cracks forming in my financial dam were invisible to me. I was too focused on the bridge I was building. Then came her brother's motorcycle. It wasn't a toy, she explained carefully. It was his livelihood. He used it for a delivery service, and its broken engine meant a whole branch of the family's income had been severed. The logic was flawless, a perfect appeal to my practical logistics manager mind. Fixing the bike wasn't a handout. It was a strategic investment in their self-sufficiency. I was restoring a vital piece of their economic engine. The amount was larger this time, but the return, seeing them get back on their feet, seemed more than worth it. I was helping them help themselves, a far cry from just throwing money at a problem. As I sent the money for the motorcycle, a small, traitorous thought flickered in my mind, a brief flash of calculation, the first shadow of doubt. But I extinguished it immediately. What was I doing? Questioning her? Trust was the foundation of everything. To hesitate would be an insult. I was being tested, I decided, not by her, but by fate. The universe was asking me if I was truly all in, if I was willing to do what it took to be part of this family. I clicked send with a renewed sense of commitment. I wasn't just fixing a motorcycle. I was proving my love, and the quiet hum from my rapidly diminishing reservoir was a small price to pay for that. The emergencies began to feel smaller, more intimate. A niece who needed a new uniform for school, shamed by her tattered clothes. A cousin who lost his phone, his only link to job opportunities. Each story was a miniature drama, a heart-wrenching vignette where I was the only one who could write a happy ending. Each problem could be solved for a price that, to me, was trivial. $100 here, $50 there. I was a giant walking through a land of tiny problems, and my wallet was a magic wand. The small fissures in my financial dam were multiplying, each request a tiny spiderweb crack, but the structure still felt solid from a distance. I began to see myself as the benevolent patriarch of this extended family, a role I relished. My $250,000 wasn't a retirement fund anymore. It was the family's central bank, a source of stability in their chaotic world. My approval ratings had never been higher. The video calls were filled with smiling relatives, all thanking Sir Donald. I was converting my sterile American dollars into something warm and real, gratitude, belonging, and love. I wasn't losing money, I was trading up. This defensive justification became my mantra. a shield against the creeping realization that my reservoir was draining at a rate that was no longer insignificant. The first major crack in the dam appeared with a frantic, tear-filled call. It was about the family land, the small plot where Rosalie's mother's house stood. A distant relative had emerged from the woodwork, brandishing a supposed legal document and claiming ownership. They needed a lawyer, an expensive one, to fight this. The threat was existential. They could lose their home. Rosalie's voice was thick with panic, painting a terrifying picture of her entire family being thrown onto the street. My role was clear. I was the knight, and this was the dragon I had to slay. This wasn't a small leak. This was a potential biblical flood. The amount they needed for the lawyer was staggering, more than all the previous requests combined. It was the first withdrawal that made me physically sweat. My nest egg wasn't just a number on a screen. It was 30 years of my life, of getting up before dawn and coming home after dark. This single payment represented a full year of that sacrifice. But what was the alternative? To let them become homeless? To reveal myself as a fair-weather-only hero? I told myself this was the big one, the final test. I sent the money, feeling a lurch in my stomach, as the largest fissure yet fractured the foundation of my financial security. After the money was wired, an unsettling silence fell. The immediate crisis was over, but the easy warmth of our conversations was replaced by a low-grade hum of anxiety. I started checking my bank balance compulsively, a new, nervous habit. Every "I love you" from Rosalie felt like it was preceding a "but I need." The man who had been the king of his own destiny now felt like a glorified ATM, waiting for the next withdrawal. The dream wasn't a nightmare yet, but it was no longer the blissful paradise I had signed up for. I was living in a state of suspended dread, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Rosalie, ever perceptive, must have sensed the shift in me. The tone of our calls changed. The affection became more intense, the declarations of love more desperate, the future she painted more vivid and intoxicating. She wasn't asking for money now. She was selling me the dream it was buying. She talked about the house we would build, the children we might have, the life of peace and love that awaited me. It was a masterful performance. She was shoring up my resolve, reminding me what I was fighting for. Each dollar was a brick in our future home, each withdrawal a down payment on a lifetime of happiness. And I, a man starved for that dream, was her most eager customer. The legal battle for the land was a resounding success, and my money was the silent hero of the story. Rosalie called me, weeping with joy, telling me I had saved them, that I was their guardian angel. The victory, however, didn't bring relief. It created a new kind of pressure. The land was now theirs again, free and clear, but it was just sitting there, vulnerable. Rosalie began talking about how we needed to secure it, to make it truly ours. It was a subtle shift in language from her family's land to our land, a change I was so desperate to hear that I didn't question the invisible contract I was signing with every nod of agreement. The idea was presented to me over a video call, a full family affair. Rosalie sat in the middle, her mother and brother flanking her, all of them looking at me with a mixture of reverence and desperate hope. It was time to stop patching leaks and start building a fortress, she explained. A house. Not just a house, but our house. A beautiful concrete symbol of our future, built on the land I had just saved. It would be an investment, she argued, something real and tangible, much smarter than letting my money wither away in an American bank. It was the ultimate step, the final project to unite us forever. The numbers she quoted made the air leave my lungs. It was more than half of what I had left. The old me, the cautious logistics manager, screamed from a deep, forgotten part of my brain. "You can't own the land," he yelled. "The paperwork will all be in her name." But that voice was drowned out by the image of Rosalie's face, her eyes shining with unshed tears as she talked about waking up next to me every morning in a home we built together. The fear of losing that dream was infinitely more terrifying than the fear of losing the money. This was the leap of faith I had to take. The plan quickly became a tidal wave of excitement that swept me along. My phone buzzed constantly with architectural sketches, color swatches, and links to furniture. The family started referring to the project as Sir Donald's house. Backing out now would be like canceling a wedding on the day of the ceremony. I was no longer just a man. I was a project manager, the benevolent financier of a dream that was now bigger than me, bigger than Rosalie. I was building a monument not to our love, but to my commitment, and the cost was becoming secondary to the fear of what would happen if I stopped. On our last call before the transfer, Rosalie didn't talk about money. She talked about life. She painted a picture so vivid, I could almost feel the warm breeze from the veranda of the house I hadn't yet paid for. She described the room we'd save for my kids when they visited, the mango tree we would plant in the garden, the quiet evenings we would spend together, finally at peace. "This is it, my love," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "This is the last big step. After this, no more asking, no more emergencies, just us, forever." And so I found myself in the sterile quiet of my American home, the online banking portal glowing on my screen. The wire transfer form was filled out. The amount, a breathtaking six-figure number, stared back at me, representing almost 30 years of my life. My hand hovered over the mouse, trembling. A picture of Rosalie, smiling her radiant smile, was taped to the corner of the monitor. I thought of the silence, the crushing gray emptiness of my life before her. I closed my eyes, took a breath that felt like it was my last, and clicked the button. A small confirmation window appeared. The money was gone. For a moment after the wire transfer, there was only silence. It was a strange, hollow quiet, not the peaceful silence I had imagined would follow my grand gesture, but an unnerving void. The constant hum of messages, the daily video calls, the endless stream of photos and plans, it all just stopped. I told myself they were busy, that the first flush of construction was all-consuming. But the silence stretched from a day into 2, then 3. The family group chat, once a river of gratitude, was now a dried-up bed of stone. My role as benevolent king seemed to have been written out of the script the moment my money had arrived. I tried to force the connection back to life, sending cheerful, open-ended questions about the progress, about what color they were painting the trim. The replies, when they came at all, were hours later, single-word answers from Rosalie's number. "Good. Fine. Busy, my love." The video calls I requested were met with excuses. Bad signal, busy with contractors, her phone was dying. I was a project manager who had been locked out of the worksite after funding the entire operation. The panic began as a slow, cold creep up my spine. My life savings were gone, and the future I had purchased in exchange was suddenly, terrifyingly out of stock. The dread became a physical thing, a weight in my chest that made it hard to breathe. This wasn't how a woman in love acted. This was how a business partner acted after a successful transaction. The feeling of being a fool was so overwhelming I could taste it. I did something I should have done a year earlier. I reached out to another expat I'd met on a forum, a cynical old-timer who lived in a nearby city. I sent him a message, trying to sound casual, asking if he'd ever heard of Rosalie's family or the big construction project in her village. His reply came back in under a minute, a single line of text that detonated my world. "You mean the Sir Donald house? Yeah, the whole village is laughing. That's the third one they've built with foreigner money. The wedding is this weekend." I read the words, but my brain refused to assemble them into a coherent thought. It was like watching a bomb fall from a plane, a silent, slow-motion descent, and knowing you were standing directly at ground zero. A wedding. It wasn't a typo. It wasn't a mistake. It was a final invoice for a bill I had already paid in full. My hands moved without any conscious thought, a desperate, frantic scramble for proof, for anything that would make this not true. I started digging, fueled by a surge of pure, unadulterated adrenaline. I searched her name, her brother's name, anything. I found a public Facebook profile belonging to one of her cousins, a woman I had sent money to for a dental emergency. Her page was a public chronicle of their lives, unfiltered and honest, in a way my private chats with Rosalie never were. I scrolled down, my vision blurring, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. And then I saw it. The curtain didn't just fall, it was ripped away, exposing the pathetic, flimsy stage set of my life. It was a photo album, posted just one day before. The title was Rosalie's Bridal Shower. There she was, my Rosalie, laughing and opening gifts, surrounded by her family, all of them beaming. In one picture, she held up a framed photo of the man she was marrying, a young, handsome Filipino man. In another, she stood next to a brand new motorcycle, a gift, the caption read. My gift, the one I had bought for her brother. But the final image was the one that stopped my heart. It was a selfie of Rosalie, grinning ear to ear, and behind her, the unmistakable, half-finished frame of my house. The screen burned with the images, a digital bonfire of my life. For an hour, maybe two, I didn't move. I was no longer a person. I was a crash site, a collection of smoking debris where a man used to be. The silence in my American house, once a source of quiet dread, was now a tomb-like vacuum, the final confirmation of my own non-existence. Every message I had ever sent, every dollar I had wired, replayed in my mind, not as acts of love, but as the pathetic, predictable clicks of a ratchet, tightening a snare around my own neck until the final, brutal snap. My body moved before my mind did, booking a flight on a credit card I knew I couldn't pay. It was a pilgrimage of the damned. I had to see the wreckage with my own eyes. When I arrived in the village, the air had changed. The children who once ran up to me shouting, "Sir Donald," now fell silent and hid. The smiles of the adults were gone, replaced by a mixture of pity and contempt. I walked to the house, my house, and saw them. Rosalie was there, her new husband beside her, his arm draped possessively around her. They were laughing. The family stood in the doorway like a phalanx of guards, their faces cold stone, barring my entry to the monument of my own stupidity. I tried to speak, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't form. It was Rosalie's new husband who finally broke the silence, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. He gestured to the house, a grand sweep of his arm. "Thank you for the gift," he said, the words a perfectly sharpened knife twisting in my gut. "You are very generous." The entire family smirked. The law was on their side. I was a foreigner who couldn't own land, a fool who had willingly given his money away. I was a ghost at a feast, watching them consume the last remnants of my life, and there was nothing I could do but watch. My retreat was a blur of shame. I found a cheap, grimy room in Manila and watched my last few $100s evaporate. The phone call to my son was the most humiliating act of my life. I mumbled something about a bad investment, a problem, needing a flight home. His sigh on the other end of the line was a verdict, the sound of a patient son dealing with a senile father. He bought the ticket. I had traded my entire life savings, my home, my future, for a one-way economy class ticket back to a country where I had nothing left. A charity case sponsored by my own disappointed child. Standing in the Manila airport, waiting for my flight, I felt like a shipwreck survivor who had washed ashore with nothing but the clothes on his back. I saw him across the terminal, another old American, his face flush with excitement, holding a welcome sign, waiting for his own Rosalie to appear. He was me, 1 year ago. He was beaming with a hope so bright it was blinding, the same idiotic hope that had led me here. I wanted to scream a warning, to tell him to run, but my throat was closed. I was just a reflection in the glass, a ghost of his future, and I turned away before he could see his own ruin in my eyes. So if you're sitting there in your quiet house, scrolling through those videos and dreaming of your own second act, let me ask you something. Do you really believe your nest egg makes you a king? It doesn't. It makes you a target. That money isn't a shield. It's a giant, flashing neon sign that says, "Here is a man who will trade his life savings for a smile." I thought my $250,000 was buying me a future, but all it bought was a role in a well-rehearsed play. My story isn't a tragedy. It's a business model, and my loneliness was just the cost of customer acquisition. You need to learn the rules of a game you don't even know you're playing. It starts with the small, reasonable requests. The emergency medical bill, the broken motorcycle essential for a livelihood, the school fees for a niece. You think you're being a provider, but you're just passing an audition. You're being onboarded as the new family ATM. Then comes the grand finale, the business venture, the house built on land you can't own. They call it our future. It's a ghost collateral partnership where your money is the only thing that's real, and its only purpose is to disappear into their hands. Look at me. This is the end of the line. I'm a man who lost everything, and now my only purpose is to be a warning. Think of me as a lighthouse, built on the wreckage of my own ship, my ruin now a desperate light to keep you off the rocks. You can learn this lesson by listening to me, or you can pay the full price, just like I did. The choice is yours. You can keep chasing the fantasy they're selling you, the perfect wife, the cheap paradise, the life of a king. Or you can wake up before you find yourself right here, with nothing left but a story to tell.